Welcome back. Today, we're diving into the complete story of BioShock. If you enjoy immersive game stories like this, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more. Now, let's begin. In the aftermath of the Second World War, when nations counted their dead and idealists dreamed of new beginnings, one man looked at the world with profound disgust. Andrew Ryan, born Andrei Ryanovsky, in a Russian village that would be consumed by revolution, had fled the Bolsheviks as a young man, carrying with him a hatred of collectivism that burned like phosphorus. America had given him sanctuary, opportunity, and eventually fortune. But even there, he watched as governments grew fat on taxation, as bureaucrats strangled innovation, as the exceptional were forced to bend knee to the mediocre masses. Ryan had a vision, and it was magnificent in its ambition. A city where the artist would not fear the censor, where the scientist would not be bound by petty morality, where the great would not be constrained by the small. A city free from the parasites from Washington, from Moscow, from the Vatican. A city that would be, in his own words, a city where the great would not be held back by the weak. But you cannot build such a city on the surface, where governments might interfere and armies might invade. No, Ryan's paradise would need to be hidden, protected by the very elements themselves. And so, in 1946, construction began on something the world had never seen. An entire metropolis on the ocean floor, built in secret by the finest minds money could acquire, powered by geothermal vents deep beneath the Atlantic. They called it Rapture. Imagine it towers of Art Deco elegance rising from the abyssal plain, connected by tunnels of glass through which the ocean itself became architecture. Whales drifting past like living clouds, bioluminescent creatures providing an ever-shifting display. Rapture was a jewel in the darkness, a place where neon glowed against the crushing deep, where every surface spoke of human ambition made manifest. The city's residents arrived in the late 1940s, traveling by bathysphere from a lighthouse that stood alone in the North Atlantic, descending through thousands of feet of water to find this impossible dream made real. And for a time, oh, for a glorious time, it worked. The best minds fled to Rapture. Artists, engineers, scientists, freed from ethical constraints, entrepreneurs who saw unlimited potential. The city hummed with innovation. Theaters staged performances that would never survive censorship on the surface. Laboratories pursued research considered too dangerous, too radical above. The economy thrived on pure objectivism, unshackled from taxation and regulation. Among those who came to Rapture was a woman named Brigid Tenenbaum, a Jewish scientist who had survived the concentration camps by performing experiments for the Nazis, experiments that had stripped away her capacity for guilt. In Rapture, she found herself free to pursue knowledge without limitation. Alongside her worked Yi Suchong, a scientist whose ambition outpaced his ethics by a considerable margin, and their benefactor was a man named Frank Fontaine. Now, Fontaine was everything Andrew Ryan, despised in principle, but recognized in practice, a man from the gutters of New York, a criminal with the mind of a businessman and the morals of a shark. While Ryan had built Rapture on the philosophy of objectivism, believing that rational self-interest would create a perfect society, Fontaine understood something Ryan refused to acknowledge. That freedom without restraint simply meant the strong would devour the weak more efficiently. Fontaine established himself as a power in Rapture through an orphanage. A curious choice in a city with no poor, you might think. But Fontaine had discovered something extraordinary. On New Year's Eve, 1958, a bathysphere arrived in Rapture carrying a family, but something went catastrophically wrong. The sphere crashed, killing the parents, leaving only their young son alive. When this boy bled, his blood did something impossible. It healed him, healed others, interacted with a peculiar species of sea slug that Tenenbaum had discovered on the ocean floor. These slugs, seemingly insignificant creatures, produced a substance that Tenenbaum and Suchong had isolated and named Adam. When introduced to human stem cells, Adam could rewrite genetic code on the fly, allowing for modifications to the human body that bordered on the supernatural. Telekinesis, pyrokinesis, control over electricity. These were no longer fantasy, but commodities that could be bought and sold. But Adam was difficult to produce until they discovered that young girls, their bodies still developing, could host the sea slugs and produce Adam in quantities large enough to fuel an industry. Fontaine, always the entrepreneur, created the Little Sisters, young girls surgically altered to host the slugs, mentally conditioned to extract Adam from the dead bodies that would soon litter Rapture's streets. And to protect these valuable assets, Suchong designed the Big Daddies. Men stripped of their humanity, sealed in massive diving suits, mentally bonded to the Little Sisters through reconditioning so complete that they existed only to protect their assigned charges. The first prototypes were the Bouncers, massive and brutal, followed by the Rosies, armed with rivet guns. Ryan, who prided himself on free market principles, watched Fontaine Futuristics grow with increasing alarm. Here was a man who had no ideology, no philosophy, just hunger. Fontaine's Adam trade was creating an underclass of desperate addicts, people who had spliced themselves with so much genetic modification that they had lost their minds, their humanity. They called these wretches splicers, and they haunted Rapture's corridors, mumbling to themselves, attacking anything that moved, desperate for more Adam to fuel their addictions. The tension between Ryan and Fontaine grew unbearable. Ryan, for all his talk of free markets, couldn't tolerate a rival. On the surface, he positioned himself as the champion of liberty, but beneath that rhetoric lay a dictator's heart. When Fontaine grew too powerful, Ryan simply nationalized Fontaine Futuristics, claiming it for the city, which meant claiming it for himself. But Fontaine was not so easily defeated. He faked his death in a shootout, leaving his empire in apparent ruins while he went underground, adopting a new identity. He became Atlas, a working-class hero with an Irish accent and a gift for rousing rhetoric, positioning himself as the champion of Rapture's lower classes against Ryan's tyranny. What had been a philosophical experiment was becoming a war zone. By late 1959, Rapture was tearing itself apart. Atlas led open rebellion against Ryan, promising the desperate splicers that he would overthrow the tyrant and redistribute the wealth. Ryan responded with increasing brutality, using security forces and his own genetically modified soldiers to maintain control. The beautiful corridors became battlegrounds, bodies piled up, providing the Little Sisters with an endless supply of Adam to harvest. And Tenenbaum, watching the horror she had helped create, felt something she thought the camps had burned out of her: guilt. She looked at the Little Sisters' children she had helped transform into something inhuman and saw for the first time not assets, but victims. She began to question everything she'd done in the name of science without conscience. The man who would change everything arrived in Rapture with no memory of his own past. He would come to know himself as Jack, though even that name would prove to be a carefully constructed lie. His arrival was spectacular: a plane crash in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, the aircraft plummeting from the sky for no apparent reason, passengers screaming as they fell toward the dark water below. Jack alone survived, swimming through burning wreckage to reach a lighthouse that stood impossibly alone in the vast ocean. The lighthouse was Art Deco, its architecture distinctly retro, with a sign that read, "No gods or kings, only man," Andrew Ryan's motto, though Jack didn't know it yet. Inside, the lighthouse was pristine, maintained, waiting. A bathysphere sat ready for departure. And what else was there to do but climb inside? The descent was extraordinary. The sphere dropped through darkness, then through the depths, and suddenly Rapture revealed itself in all its broken glory. The city still glowed, though now that light seemed fevered, desperate. Even through the thick glass of the bathysphere, you could see the damage: shattered windows, collapsed corridors, signs of battle everywhere. And as Jack descended, a film began to play, Andrew Ryan's original Welcome to Rapture, his voice full of pride and certainty as he described his paradise free from the parasites. The irony was devastating. Ryan's recording spoke of achievement and greatness, while Jack passed through a city consumed by civil war, its splendor rotting into horror. The bathysphere docked in an arrival area that showed signs of recent violence. Bodies lay scattered, some long dead, others fresh enough to steam in the cold, recycled air. And then, through a radio, came a voice, warm, concerned, with a working-class Irish accent that spoke of solidarity and shared struggle. "Would you kindly pick up that shortwave radio?" The voice belonged to Atlas, or so he claimed. He explained that he was trapped, that his family, his wife and child were in danger, that Ryan's forces were trying to kill them. He needed help. And Jack, having no other options and perhaps moved by a basic human desire to help, agreed. What followed was a journey through Rapture's heart of darkness. Jack moved through districts that had once represented the pinnacle of human achievement, now transformed into chambers of horror. The Kashmir restaurant, where the elite had once dined on delicacies while discussing philosophy and profit, had become a lair for splicers who muttered about parasites and angels. Fort Frolic, an entertainment district designed to rival anything on the surface, was now the domain of Sander Cohen, an artist whose madness had been amplified by Adam into something genuinely monstrous. He now murdered his dancers and students, transforming them into twisted art installations. Everywhere Jack went, Atlas guided him, the voice in the radio offering advice, encouragement, and direction. "Would you kindly" became a familiar phrase, a polite request that Jack found himself unable to refuse. "Would you kindly go to this location? Would you kindly kill this person? Would you kindly help me save my family?" And Jack complied, because it seemed reasonable, because Atlas was kind and Ryan was clearly a monster. The evidence was everywhere. Recordings left behind by Rapture's residents, audio diaries that told stories of Ryan's increasing paranoia and brutality, his willingness to sacrifice anyone and anything to maintain control. Jack also encountered Bridget Tenenbaum, the scientist who had created the Little Sisters. She had developed a serum, she explained, that could cure the girls, reverse the conditioning and the genetic modification, return them to something approaching normal. She begged Jack to use it, to spare the children rather than harvesting them for their Adam. The choice was his. Drain the Little Sisters, killing them but gaining more Adam for personal power, or save them, gaining less but preserving their humanity. This choice would define Jack's journey, though, in truth, the choice itself was perhaps less significant than the fact that he was allowed to make it at all. Through Hephaestus, Rapture's geothermal power plant, through Arcadia, where Rapture's oxygen was produced by vast indoor gardens now overgrown and wild, Jack fought his way forward. The splicers grew more desperate, more twisted. Some had spliced themselves into hulking brutes, their bodies swollen with unnatural muscle. Others moved with inhuman speed, their metabolisms accelerated beyond sustainability. Still others had developed the ability to throw fire or electricity, though the modifications had cost them their sanity. The Big Daddies proved to be formidable obstacles. These protectors of the Little Sisters were single-minded and nearly unstoppable. When Jack approached their charges, they would attack with mechanical fury, requiring all of Jack's growing arsenal of weapons and plasmids to defeat. Yet even in victory, there was something tragic about them. They had been men once, before Suchong's conditioning stripped away everything but protective instinct. Atlas's family was supposedly trapped in a submarine, unable to escape, while Ryan maintained control of Rapture's systems. To save them, Jack would need to get close to Ryan himself to penetrate the dictator's inner sanctum. And so Jack fought on through Ryan's finest security forces, past automated turrets and security cameras, through corridors lined with propaganda that grew increasingly desperate. The recordings Jack found painted a picture of Rapture's fall. He learned of Fontaine's death and Atlas's rise, of Ryan's nationalization of private industry, a supreme irony for a man who had built an entire city on the principle of unfettered capitalism. He learned of experiments conducted in the name of progress, of people transformed into monsters, of the price paid for absolute freedom from ethics and restraint. And finally, impossibly, Jack reached Ryan's office, a massive chamber decorated with symbols of triumph, with imagery that positioned Ryan as Rapture's savior and sole hope. The man himself sat waiting, calmly playing golf as Jack entered, as if receiving a visitor rather than an assassin. What Ryan said next would shatter everything Jack thought he knew. I know you are Atlas's puppet, Ryan began, his voice calm, almost amused. He explained that Jack was not a survivor of a random plane crash, but a weapon, carefully designed and deployed. Fontaine, operating as Atlas, had commissioned Jack's creation literally. Jack was genetically modified before birth, designed to age rapidly from embryo to adult, conditioned with a mental trigger that made him susceptible to control. The trigger was a simple phrase. Would you kindly? When Atlas said those 3 words, Jack was compelled to obey. It wasn't a choice. It was programming embedded so deeply that Jack couldn't even perceive his own lack of free will. Every action Jack had taken since arriving in Rapture, every decision he thought he'd made, all of it had been Atlas directing a puppet through verbal commands. The plane crash itself had been orchestrated, caused by Jack acting on a command implanted years ago. Even Jack's arrival at the lighthouse had been guided, scripted, inevitable. A man chooses, Ryan said, his voice heavy with bitter triumph. A slave obeys. And then, to prove his point absolutely, to demonstrate the completeness of Jack's slavery, Ryan handed Jack a golf club and spoke the trigger phrase. He commanded Jack to kill him, and Jack, despite any desire to stop, despite any horror at what he was doing, obeyed. The golf club rose and fell, and Andrew Ryan, builder of Rapture, prophet of objectivism, dictator of the deep, died at the hands of his enemy's weapon, vindicated in his belief that freedom was an illusion and control was everything. In the aftermath, as Jack stood over Ryan's body, Atlas dropped his mask. The Irish accent faded, replaced by Fontaine's natural voice, smoother and infinitely more cruel. He had won. Ryan was dead, and Jack had been the perfect tool. Now, Fontaine intended to use Jack's genetic code for Jack was Ryan's illegitimate son, created from Ryan's DNA, and thus capable of accessing Ryan's genetic locks throughout Rapture to take complete control of the city. But Fontaine had underestimated Tenenbaum. The scientist, still working to redeem herself, had been studying Jack, and she had developed a way to break Fontaine's conditioning. The process was agonizing. Jack's body convulsed as the genetic triggers were burned out of his system, but when it was done, he was free. Truly free. Perhaps for the first time in his accelerated life. Now came the final confrontation. Fontaine had been using Adam extensively, splicing himself with every advantage he could acquire. By the time Jack reached him in his sanctuary, Fontaine had transformed into something barely human, a creature of golden light and monstrous power, surrounded by little sisters who he had commanded to inject him with their Adam. The battle was desperate. Fontaine hurled fire and ice telekinetically through debris, seemed almost invulnerable. But Jack had the little sisters, the ones he had saved or the ones Tenenbaum had convinced to help. They swarmed Fontaine, stabbing him with their Adam-extracting needles, draining the power that made him superhuman. Weakened, mortal again, Fontaine fell to Jack's weapons, dying as he had lived grasping for power until the very end. In the aftermath, Jack faced a choice that Tenenbaum suggested. He could leave Rapture, return to the surface, try to build a normal life with the little sisters he had saved as his family. Or he could remain in the deep, perhaps to rule over Ryan's failed paradise, or perhaps to become just another monster in the darkness. The choice, this time, was genuinely his own. But Jack's story is only one thread in a larger tapestry. And to understand the full scope of what Rapture became, we must turn our attention to another soul who descended into those depths, a soul that arrived during Rapture's fall, when the city was already consuming itself, but before Jack's arrival would catalyze its final collapse. This was Subject Delta, though he had no name, no identity beyond that clinical designation. He was one of the first big daddies, a test subject for the bonding process that would create the Little Sisters' immortal guardians. Where later models would be mindless, Delta retained fragments of his consciousness, though bound absolutely to a particular little sister, a young girl designated as Eleanor Lamb. Eleanor's mother was Sophia Lamb, and here we encounter a figure who in many ways represented the ideological counterpoint to Andrew Ryan. Where Ryan was an objectivist who believed in the supremacy of the individual, Lamb was a collectivist who preached the subordination of the self to the greater good. She was a psychiatrist, brilliant and utterly convinced of her own righteousness, and she saw in Rapture's decay proof that Ryan's philosophy was bankrupt. Lamb had come to Rapture with her daughter, intending to escape a failed marriage and find new opportunities. Instead, she found herself in a city tearing apart, and she saw opportunity in the chaos. While Ryan and Fontaine warred for control, Lamb built her own following, preaching that the only way to save humanity was to transcend individual desire, to create a perfect human consciousness uncorrupted by selfishness. But there was a problem. Her daughter Eleanor had been bonded to Subject Delta as part of Suchong's experiments. The bond was absolute. Eleanor felt what Delta felt, and vice versa. When Lamb discovered this, she saw it as contamination, her daughter's mind polluted by connection to another consciousness. And so, on New Year's Eve, 1958, Lamb did something that showcased the depth of her conviction. She forced Delta to put a gun to his own head and pull the trigger. The bond should have killed Eleanor as well. Suchong's research suggested the little sisters died when their big daddies were destroyed. But Eleanor survived, perhaps because her bond with Delta was different, forged with a prototype process that hadn't yet been perfected. She fell into a coma instead, and Lamb, relieved, continued her work, using Rapture's collapse as a laboratory for her theories. 10 years passed. Rapture continued its decay, the civil war between Ryan and Atlas creating hell beneath the waves. And then, impossibly, Subject Delta woke up. The resurrection was Eleanor's doing. Over the years of her coma, Eleanor had grown in ways her mother never anticipated. The atom in her system, combined with her exposure to the collective unconscious of Rapture through the Little Sister network, had given her extraordinary abilities. She was powerful beyond even Lamb's understanding, and she had maintained her bond with Delta across the gulf of death itself. Compelled by that bond, Delta rose from whatever passed for death in Rapture's twisted biology. He woke in the Adonis Luxury Resort, a bathysphere station that had once welcomed Rapture's elite, but now stood as a monument to decay. Eleanor's voice reached him through the bond, guiding him, urging him to come find her. But Rapture in 1968 was even more nightmarish than it had been a decade before. The war had created new horrors. The splicers had degenerated further, some now wearing macabre masks made from plaster, creating families from corpses arranged in twisted tableaus. Others had formed a cult around Lamb's teachings, the Rapture family, fanatics who believed that individual identity was sin and collective consciousness was salvation. Delta's journey through Rapture to reach Eleanor would take him through districts that told the story of the city's philosophical bankruptcy. Pauper's Drop, once a modest residential area, had become a slum even by Rapture's collapse standards, ruled over by Grace Holloway, a former madam who had transformed herself into a community leader out of necessity. Ryan Amusements, a propaganda center designed to indoctrinate children into Ryan's objectivist philosophy, stood as perhaps the most darkly ironic location, a theme park dedicated to teaching children that altruism was evil and selfishness was virtue, now overrun by splicers who demonstrated the practical results of that philosophy. In Fontaine Futuristics, Delta encountered the legacy of the atom industry. Here, in Suchong's laboratories, the Little Sisters had been created, and here the Big Daddies had been perfected. Audio diaries scattered throughout revealed the casual cruelty of the research. Suchong testing the bonding process by threatening Little Sisters to see how their Big Daddies would respond, then expressing annoyance when the protectors killed him for the threat. But Delta also discovered something unexpected. Not all of Rapture's residents had descended into madness. Stanley Poole, a journalist who had documented Rapture's fall, had survived by hiding and recording, bearing witness to atrocity while lacking the courage to intervene. Augustus Sinclair, a businessman who made Fontaine look subtle, had turned survival into an industry, selling goods and services to whoever could pay. Grace Holloway, already mentioned, had created pockets of relative safety for those splicers still capable of semi-rational thought. These NPCs, though, we must avoid that term, mustn't we? These survivors each had their own relationship with Lamb and Eleanor, their own perspectives on what Rapture had become and what it might still be. Sinclair saw opportunity in the chaos, a chance to rebuild Rapture's economy with himself at the top. Poole carried guilt like a physical weight, knowing he had documented horrors without acting to stop them. Grace had become a believer in Lamb's philosophy, seeing collectivism as the only answer to Ryan's failed individualism. Eleanor herself remained an enigma. Through the bond, Delta could sense her power, her complexity. But Lamb had kept her daughter imprisoned, both physically and mentally, convinced that Eleanor needed protection from her own contaminated consciousness. Lamb was preparing something she called the utopian, a process by which Eleanor would become a perfect vessel for collective human consciousness, transcending individual identity entirely. The concept was monstrous in its own way. Lamb intended to destroy her daughter's individual personality, replacing it with a gestalt consciousness formed from Rapture's entire population. Eleanor would cease to exist as an individual and become a repository for everyone's thoughts, desires, and memories, supposedly creating a perfect being free from selfish impulse. Delta fought through new varieties of Big Daddy the Lancers, fast and aggressive with spear-like weapons, and the Rumblers, capable of launching mini-turrets. He encountered Big Sisters, Little Sisters who had grown up without being cured, transformed into svelte but deadly hunters who protected the atom economy with terrifying efficiency. Each battle was desperate, each victory costly. And through it all, Lamb spoke to Delta through the city's PA system, trying to convince him that his quest was selfish, that his bond with Eleanor was corruption, that true morality required the death of individual desire. She positioned herself as Rapture's moral savior, the one who would redeem Ryan's failed paradise by transforming it into a true utopia of collective consciousness. The philosophical debate between Ryan's extreme individualism and Lamb's extreme collectivism played out in the ruins they had both helped create. Ryan's Rapture had destroyed itself because unchecked self-interest had devolved into pure predation. Lamb's Rapture family was destroying what remained because forced altruism, dictated from above, was just another form of tyranny. Delta's choice came down to how he had interacted with the Little Sisters along his journey. If he had harvested them for Adam, becoming a monster in pursuit of power, then Eleanor would learn from his example that might makes right, that individual power justifies any action. If he had saved them, showing mercy and compassion even when it cost him, then Eleanor would learn that strength could coexist with kindness. The final confrontation occurred in Fontaine Futuristics, in Persephone, an underwater prison where Lamb had imprisoned Eleanor. By this point, Eleanor had broken free of her mother's conditioning, but the question remained, what kind of being had she become? The answer depended on Delta, on the moral example he had provided through their bond. In one version of events, Eleanor became a monster like her father had become, harvesting Little Sisters and embracing power without conscience. In another, she became something better, powerful but compassionate, individual but not selfish. And Delta, mortally wounded and dying, faced a final choice: to try to cling to life or to allow Eleanor to absorb his consciousness, his memories, his experiences, making them part of her own mind before he died. If he chose to share himself with Eleanor, then in a very real sense, Delta achieved a kind of immortality, not physical, but preserved in the mind of someone he had helped shape into a being capable of both tremendous power and genuine compassion. Eleanor would escape Rapture, taking the Little Sisters with her, returning to the surface world with Delta's perspective forever part of her own consciousness. It was a strange kind of redemption, not the grand philosophical victory that either Ryan or Lamb had sought, but something smaller and perhaps more human, an individual choice to sacrifice for another, not because collectivism demanded it, but because love made it worthwhile. But Rapture is only half the story. And to understand the full implications of what Andrew Ryan created beneath the Atlantic, we must turn our eyes skyward to a city that floated among the clouds decades before Rapture was even conceived. This is where the story becomes truly strange, where science fiction brushes against something closer to fantasy, where quantum mechanics and American exceptionalism combine into something both magnificent and terrible. In 1893, the United States was emerging as a global power, flush with industrial might and manifest destiny. The World's Fair in Chicago showcased American innovation to the globe. And among those innovations was something extraordinary. A flying city, Columbia, built by the physicist Rosalind Lutece and funded by the U.S. government under the direction of a man named Zachary Hale Comstock. Comstock was a veteran of Wounded Knee and the Boxer Rebellion, a man who had waded through slaughter in the name of American expansion and emerged convinced of America's divine mission. Where Andrew Ryan would later build Rapture to escape government and religion, Comstock built Columbia to embody them, to create a new Eden that would bring American values, or rather, his vision of American values to the world below. Columbia floated through quantum mechanics, through technology that shouldn't have been possible in the 1890s. Vast balloons kept the city aloft, but they were augmented by quantum technology derived from Lutece's research, allowing Columbia to maintain a permanent position in the clouds, invisible to the world below, through something that resembled selective perception more than physical stealth. The city was breathtaking, a vision of American idealism rendered in brass and marble, with buildings inspired by neoclassical architecture, wide promenades, and monuments to the founding fathers elevated to the status of religious icons. George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, these were not just historical figures in Columbia, but objects of worship, part of a civic religion that merged patriotism with theology. But Columbia's beauty concealed a rotting core. This was American exceptionalism taken to its most poisonous extreme, a society built explicitly on white supremacy and religious fundamentalism. While Rapture had failed because of unchecked individualism devolving into chaos, Columbia was failing because of unchecked certainty, the absolute conviction that Columbia's way was righteous and all others were heresy. The city was strictly segregated, with a white majority living in splendor while minorities, particularly Irish and Black residents, were confined to slums or forced into servitude. Propaganda was everywhere, promoting Comstock's vision of racial purity and American manifest destiny. Monuments depicted Comstock as a prophet, his image merged with religious iconography, his words treated as divine revelation. Comstock himself was aging rapidly, prematurely aged by exposure to the quantum technology that kept Columbia aloft. The Lutece device that created Columbia had a cost, and Comstock was paying it in accelerated entropy, his body breaking down even as his city thrived. But he had foreseen this, or claimed to have foreseen it. Through the Lutece device, Comstock had glimpsed other timelines, other possibilities. And he had seen a girl who would be called the Lamb, who would inherit Columbia and lead it to glory. The girl was Elizabeth, and her origin was Columbia's deepest secret. In another timeline, Zachary Comstock existed as Booker DeWitt, a man who had fought at Wounded Knee, but emerged from that slaughter broken rather than emboldened. DeWitt had refused baptism after the battle, refused to wash away his sins in religious redemption, and had instead carried his guilt into a life of drinking, gambling, and violence. He had married, had a daughter, lost his wife to childbirth, and found himself drowning in debt to dangerous people. When those people came to collect, DeWitt made a choice that would haunt him across timelines. He sold his daughter, Anna, to pay his debts. The buyer was Comstock, or rather, a version of Comstock who had discovered the existence of parallel worlds and seen in DeWitt's daughter the heir he could never father himself, sterility being another cost of his quantum exposure. The transaction occurred at a threshold between worlds, a tear in reality through which Comstock's agents attempted to carry baby Anna. DeWitt, realizing too late what he'd done, tried to take her back. The portal began to close. And in that moment, as the tear in space-time sealed itself, it severed Anna's finger, the baby's pinky finger, remaining in Booker's world, while the rest of Anna was pulled through to Columbia. That severed finger created a permanent connection between Anna and all possible timelines. She grew up in Columbia as Elizabeth Comstock's daughter, locked in a tower and guarded by a massive mechanical bird called Songbird, a creature that was equal parts protector and jailer. Elizabeth never knew she was adopted, never knew her real father was alive in another timeline, never knew that the missing finger that Comstock told her had been lost in an accident was actually a window to infinity. Because that's what Elizabeth had become, a living tear in reality, capable of opening windows to other timelines, to alternate possibilities, to worlds that might have been or might yet be. Comstock kept her in prison not just to protect her, but to control her, to ensure that when she came of age, her powers would serve Columbia's glory rather than threaten it. 20 years later, in 1912, a man arrived in Columbia with blood on his hands and a debt to pay. He was Booker DeWitt, though this version of DeWitt had no memory of the daughter he'd sold 2 decades before the trauma had been suppressed, replaced with false memories of a debt to be paid and a girl to be rescued. He arrived via rocket chair, launched from a lighthouse, always a portal, always a threshold between worlds, convinced that if he brought the girl to New York, his debts would be forgiven. DeWitt's Columbia was a city at war with itself. The pristine facades and patriotic propaganda remained, but underneath, revolution was brewing. The Vox Populi voice of the people was an insurgent movement led by Daisy Fitzroy, a black woman who had been Comstock's servant before, being framed for the murder of Comstock's wife. The Vox represented everyone Columbia oppressed: the minority workers, the poor, the disaffected, all those who had been crushed beneath American exceptionalism's boot. The conflict between Comstock's founders and Fitzroy's Vox Populi was about to explode into open warfare, and DeWitt walked directly into the ignition point. His arrival had been prophesied by Comstock, the false shepherd, who would lead the lamb astray and wanted posters bearing DeWitt's face, appeared throughout Columbia almost immediately. Comstock's security forces, led by the twisted zealot Zachary Hale Comstock and his enforcer, Cornelius Slate, hunted DeWitt through the floating city. Slate was particularly tragic. A veteran like Comstock and DeWitt, he had served with honor but found himself discarded by the prophet, who had rewritten history to glorify himself while minimizing others' contributions. Slate had created the Hall of Heroes, a museum that supposedly honored Columbia's military victories but had been sanitized by Comstock, transformed into propaganda rather than truth. Slate and his men occupied the hall, demanding a warrior's death rather than the slow decay of being forgotten. DeWitt fought through Comstock's forces and the Vox Populi alike, both sides seeing him as an enemy or a tool. He acquired vigors, Columbia's equivalent to Rapture's plasmids, genetic modifications packaged as tonics and sold from vending machines, allowing users to shoot electricity from their hands, to possess enemies' minds, to hurl fire or control crows. The technology was identical to Rapture's, though Columbia had developed it decades earlier through Rosalind Lutez's quantum research, creating a temporal paradox that suggested reality itself was less linear than it appeared. And then DeWitt found Elizabeth, locked in her tower, guarded by Songbird, desperate for freedom she'd only glimpsed in books. When DeWitt freed her, he discovered her power. She could open tiers in reality, pulling objects, weapons, even people from alternate timelines into the current one. A Gatling gun that didn't exist in this timeline could suddenly appear because in another timeline, it had been left in that exact spot. Cover could materialize from nowhere because in some other possibility, a barrier had been erected there. Elizabeth was innocent, curious, intelligent, and utterly unprepared for the reality of the world outside her tower. She had spent her life in isolation, educated by Comstock's chosen tutors, fed carefully curated information about the world. Her first exposure to Columbia's true nature, the casual racism, the brutal violence, the rot beneath the beauty, was shocking. Together, DeWitt and Elizabeth fled through Columbia, pursued by Comstock's forces and Songbird, that mechanical horror that loved Elizabeth with the programmed devotion of a father and the jealousy of a guard dog. Their flight took them through Columbia's various districts: the industrial zone where workers toiled in dangerous conditions, Shantytown where the poor were segregated from polite society, Finkton, where the industrialist Jeremiah Fink exploited both workers and Rosalind Lutez's dimensional research for profit. Fink was particularly interesting. He had been using tears in reality to observe Rapture, decades in the future, stealing technology and ideas from Souchong and Fontaine. The plasmids that would be invented in Rapture in the 1950s appeared in Columbia in the 1910s as vigors because Fink had plagiarized them across time and space. Even the Big Daddy designs appeared in Columbia as the Handyman, workers who had been transformed into mechanical giants. Though where Rapture's Big Daddies were silently protective, Columbia's Handymen were tortured souls, still conscious enough to hate what they'd become. The Lutece twins, Rosalind and her brother Robert, appeared periodically to guide DeWitt, though their guidance was cryptic and often seemed designed more to observe than to help. They existed outside normal time, appearing and disappearing at will, speaking in riddles and parallels, treating reality as a laboratory and DeWitt as an experiment, because that's what he was. The Luteces, having helped Comstock create Columbia and steal baby Anna, had experienced regret, or something approximating it, in their post-temporal existence. They had died, murdered by Comstock when he feared their knowledge would expose his secrets. But death for beings unstuck from time just meant existing in all times simultaneously. They had decided to undo their mistake by bringing multiple versions of Booker DeWitt to Columbia, hoping one would succeed in stopping Comstock. DeWitt and Elizabeth's flight eventually led them to Comstock House, where the prophet waited to explain his vision. Columbia, he revealed, would rain fire on the cities of the Sodom below, purging America and creating a new kingdom. Elizabeth, when she came of age, would lead this purge. Her powers, allowing Columbia to appear anywhere, to attack everywhere, to bring judgment to a fallen world. He showed Elizabeth a vision of this future, using the Lutece device to display a timeline where she had become his weapon, where New York burned beneath Columbia's bombardment, where she had embraced her role as the lamb who would cleanse the world. The vision showed Elizabeth aged and hardened, having become everything Comstock intended. But this vision also revealed the truth, that Comstock was Booker DeWitt, that Elizabeth was Booker's daughter, that the divide between the prophet and the false shepherd was nothing more than a single choice at a single moment, whether to accept baptism after Wounded Knee or to refuse it. Comstock was the version of DeWitt who had embraced religious absolution for his sins, using that absolution as justification for greater sins committed in the name of righteousness. DeWitt was the version who had refused forgiveness, carrying his guilt into self-destruction. The revelation broke both of them. Elizabeth realized her father had sold her, that Comstock had stolen her, that her entire existence was the result of cosmic theft and temporal paradox. DeWitt realized he was hunting himself, that the debt he'd been promised would be forgiven was the debt of selling his own daughter. In desperation, Elizabeth opened a tier to Rapture, to 1,960, to the bathysphere where Jack had descended, creating a direct connection between the two impossible cities. She used Rapture's bathyspheres, Rapture's technology, to achieve her goals in Columbia, the two cities touching across time and space. The story climaxed with the Vox Populi revolution succeeding, Daisy Fitzroy leading an uprising that was no less brutal than Comstock's oppression had been. Revolution devolved into slaughter, the oppressed becoming oppressors, violence begetting violence in an endless cycle. Fitzroy, who had legitimate grievances and just cause, became as monstrous as those she fought against, proving that righteousness without mercy creates only more suffering. Elizabeth was forced to kill Fitzroy, or, in some timelines, witness Fitzroy's death, learning that revolution was not the simple story of good versus evil she'd imagined from her books. The Vox burned Columbia as thoroughly as the founders had oppressed its people. And in the flames, Elizabeth's innocence finally died, with Songbird finally under Elizabeth's control, reprogrammed through a code that Comstock had prepared for this eventuality. DeWitt and Elizabeth confronted the prophet himself. In some timelines, DeWitt killed Comstock with his own hands, drowning the prophet in a baptismal font. The symbolic irony complete. In others, Elizabeth did it, or Comstock died by other means. But across all timelines, one truth remained. Comstock's vision died with him. Yet Elizabeth realized this wasn't enough. Comstock existed across multiple timelines, multiple possibilities. In every timeline where DeWitt accepted baptism and became Comstock, this same story would play out. Columbia would be built, Elizabeth would be stolen, the cycle would continue. The only way to end it was to prevent Comstock from ever existing. And so, Elizabeth, now able to perceive and navigate timelines, consciously brought DeWitt to the moment of baptism, to that river where he had stood after Wounded Knee, with blood on his hands and guilt in his heart. A dozen Elizabeths from different timelines appeared, all of them the same girl, all of them his daughter across infinite possibilities. They drowned him. Not the version of him that had become Comstock, but the root, the source, the Booker DeWitt who stood at the moment of choice. By drowning him before he could make either decision, before he could accept baptism and become Comstock, before he could refuse baptism and eventually sell Anna, they created a paradox that collapsed all the timelines where Columbia existed. It was a suicide of sorts. By erasing the event that created Comstock, Elizabeth erased Columbia. And in erasing Columbia, she erased the theft of baby Anna. And in erasing that theft, she erased the severed finger that gave her powers. And in erasing her powers, she erased her ability to navigate timelines. One by one, the Elizabeths standing around the baptismal font blinked out of existence as the timeline revised itself, collapsing possibilities into a single line where none of this had ever happened. In the final moments, one Elizabeth remained long enough to watch, to ensure the sacrifice was complete, and then she too faded, leaving only darkness and the sound of a baby crying Anna. In a world where her father hadn't sold her, where Columbia had never existed, where the prophet and the false shepherd were nothing but dreams. But the story doesn't end there, because in the infinite multiverse, no ending is truly final. There remain timelines, branches, possibilities that had not been sealed by Elizabeth's sacrifice. One such timeline contained a version of Booker DeWitt who remembered selling Anna, who carried that guilt with such weight that he fled to Rapture rather than face it, opening a detective agency in the city beneath the waves on New Year's Eve, 1958. This DeWitt was not the man who had stormed Columbia, nor was he the prophet who had built it. He was something else, a refugee from a collapsed possibility, existing in the wrong reality, his presence itself an anomaly. He had made himself forget, buried the memories of Anna and Elizabeth and Columbia beneath layers of alcohol and purposeful ignorance, creating a new identity in Rapture's shadows. And then she walked into his office. Elizabeth, young again, but different, harder, her eyes carrying knowledge that shouldn't be possible. She had a job for him, find a girl named Sally, a little sister who had gone missing in Rapture's chaos. The Rapture they inhabited was pristine, untouched by civil war, still gleaming with Ryan's original vision. This was Rapture before the fall, on the very day when everything would begin to collapse. And Elizabeth knew it, because she existed outside normal causality, remembering timelines that had been erased, carrying knowledge from realities that no longer existed. The search for Sally took DeWitt through Rapture's glory, the Kashmir restaurant still serving elite clients, Fort Frolic still hosting performances, the streets still safe enough for citizens to walk without fear. But darkness lurked at the edges. Suchong's experiments were ongoing, the Little Sisters were being created, Fontaine was building his empire, and Ryan's paranoia was growing. DeWitt found Sally in Fontaine's department store, a child hiding among the toys, terrified and alone. But when he reached for her, when he looked into her eyes, memory crashed back like a tidal wave. This was Anna, or rather a version of Anna, a little sister who was his daughter across timelines, and he had hurt her again, failed her again, and the weight of it was unbearable. In his desperation to reach her, DeWitt triggered an event that attracted a Big Daddy. The ensuing fight was brutal, desperate, and ultimately fatal. The Big Daddy impaled DeWitt on its drill, and as he died, reality shifted. The pristine Rapture dissolved into the Rapture of late 1958, the Rapture already tearing apart, the Civil War underway. And Elizabeth, the one who had hired DeWitt, who had orchestrated this entire sequence, was revealed in her true form, or as close to it as she could manage. She had lost her powers when Columbia was erased, but retained her memories of infinite timelines. She had engineered DeWitt's redemption and punishment simultaneously, giving him a chance to save a version of Anna while ensuring he faced consequences for his original sin. But now Elizabeth herself was trapped in Rapture, powerless, mortal, facing a city descending into hell. And she had one final mission, one last debt to pay across timelines. She needed to ensure that Sally survived, that this little sister would be saved by Jack when he eventually descended to Rapture. Because Sally was important not just as a symbol, but as a linchpin in causality, a child whose survival or death would ripple across timelines. What followed was Elizabeth's journey through Rapture's darkest corners, now experiencing it not as a tourist or investigator, but as a vulnerable woman trapped in a nightmare. The splicers were emerging, people who had overused Adam transforming into monsters. The security forces were cracking down with increasing brutality. The big daddies patrolled the corridors, and the little sisters, those haunting children, harvested Adam from the growing piles of corpses. Elizabeth had to become something she never wanted to be, a survivor at any cost. She stole, lied, manipulated, and when necessary, killed. The woman who had once been naive and hopeful, who had seen the best in people, was systematically stripped of her illusions by Rapture's casual cruelty. She encountered Atlas, still masquerading as a working-class hero, still building his rebellion against Ryan. Atlas captured Elizabeth, seeing her as a tool to be used, a person with knowledge he could exploit. He wanted her to retrieve something called the ace in the hole, a weapon or a key that would allow him to control the big daddies, to turn Ryan's protectors into Atlas's army. Elizabeth knew who Atlas really was: Frank Fontaine, the criminal who would eventually use Jack as a weapon against Ryan. She knew the ace in the hole was the control phrase, "Would you kindly?" the trigger that would make Jack a puppet. And she knew that if she refused to help Atlas retrieve it, he would torture and kill Sally, the little sister she had sworn to protect. The choice was impossible. If Elizabeth helped Atlas, she would be enabling Jack's enslavement, creating the weapon that would allow Fontaine to control Ryan's son and orchestrate Rapture's final collapse. But if she refused, Sally would die, and Elizabeth's promise, her last act of redemption across timelines, would be broken. Rapture's true horror wasn't the monsters or the decay. It was the way it forced moral compromise, the way survival required sacrificing principles. Ryan had built a city without ethical constraints, and the result was a place where every choice was tainted, where doing the right thing for one person meant doing wrong to another. Elizabeth chose Sally. She broke into Suchong's laboratories, navigating past big daddies and splicers, through rooms where children were being surgically altered into little sisters, past cages where the worst experiments were conducted. She found the control phrase, the key to Jack's mind, and she delivered it to Atlas, knowing exactly what she was enabling. Atlas, true to form, betrayed her. He took the information and ordered her killed. But not before Elizabeth ensured that Sally would be rescued, would be among the little sisters that Tenenbaum would eventually save, would survive to be rescued by Jack when he descended to Rapture in 1960. Elizabeth died in Rapture, beaten to death by Atlas's thugs, alone in the darkness of Suchong's laboratory, her last thoughts on the girl she'd saved and the cycle she'd failed to break. Her death was quiet, meaningless in the context of Rapture's greater horrors, just another body for the little sisters to harvest. But in dying, Elizabeth completed a circle. She had ensured Sally's survival, which meant Jack would have little sisters to save or harvest, which meant Tenenbaum would have reason to create her cure, which meant redemption would be possible even in Rapture's depths. She had traded her life and her moral purity to ensure that Jack would have a choice, the very thing that had been stolen from him. It was a strange kind of victory, purchased at the cost of everything Elizabeth had been. The girl who had wanted to see Paris, who had loved dancing, who had believed in the goodness of people, died in darkness, having become a killer and a collaborator. her innocence sacrificed to protect one child from the machine that consumed children. And so we arrive at the end, or perhaps at the understanding that there is no end, only cycles and patterns repeating across timelines. Let us step back and see the full picture, the themes that connect Rapture beneath the Atlantic to Columbia in the clouds, the philosophies that destroyed both impossible cities. Andrew Ryan and Zachary Comstock were mirror images, each building a utopia based on absolute conviction. Ryan believed in the supremacy of the individual, in freedom from all collective restraint, and created a city that devolved into chaos as the strong devoured the weak without mercy or limit. Comstock believed in the supremacy of his vision, in freedom through submission to divine will, and created a city that ossified into tyranny as certainty crushed all dissent. Sophia Lamb represented a third path collectivism, the subordination of individual desire to common good, but her rapture was no better, just a different form of tyranny disguised as altruism. Whether you called it objectivism, religious fundamentalism, or collectivism, the result was the same. Utopia built on absolute ideology became dystopia when human complexity refused to fit the theory. The cities themselves were characters in this story, beautiful and terrible, their architecture reflecting the dreams that created them. Rapture was Art Deco elegance turned sepulchral, a tomb lit by bioluminescence, where every corridor whispered promises of achievement and screamed with the reality of failure. Columbia was American idealism rendered in brass and marble, a heaven that revealed itself as hell when you looked beneath the surface, where every monument to the founders was built on bones. The monsters that haunted both cities were human creations, not supernatural horrors, but the logical result of freedom without ethics. The splicers were capitalism's endpoint, consumers who had literally consumed themselves in pursuit of advantages. The big daddies were protection turned grotesque, love transformed into programming, fathers reduced to functions. The handymen were industry's cost, workers transformed into machines, their consciousness preserved just enough to suffer. And the children, the little sisters, Sally, Eleanor, Elizabeth herself, were innocence destroyed by systems that treated people as resources. Each city created its own way to exploit the young. Rapture transformed girls into atom factories. Columbia locked Elizabeth in a tower to be weaponized, and both justified these horrors through ideology. Ryan called it freedom of research, Comstock called it divine will, but the result was the same: childhood stolen and commodified. Jack's journey was about discovering agency in a world designed to deny it. He was created to be a tool, programmed to obey, yet in the space between "would you kindly" and his own choices about the little sisters, he found genuine free will. His decision to save or harvest wasn't about game mechanics. It was about whether a person designed to be a slave could choose to be something else, whether nature or nurture or programming determined who we are. Subject Delta's story was about love, surviving death, and indoctrination. He was stripped of humanity, turned into a machine, bonded to Eleanor through Su Chong's cruel science. Yet something of his consciousness persisted. His relationship with Eleanor was one of the few genuine connections in either city, not based on ideology or utility, but on a bond that persisted despite every attempt to erase it. Booker DeWitt's tragedy was that he was both the hero and the villain, the victim and the perpetrator. His choice to sell Anna created Comstock, and Comstock's existence created the necessity to stop himself, and stopping himself required drowning the man he was before he could become either the prophet or the failure. The baptism at Wounded Knee became the nexus point of infinite possibilities, each choice creating new timelines, new Elizabeths, new variations on the same story. Elizabeth's sacrifice drowning her father to erase Comstock was both noble and terrible. She murdered an innocent man to prevent the monster he might become, committing a sin to prevent greater sins. And in Rapture, she learned the cost of that choice, discovering that preventing one horror simply created space for different horrors, that breaking one cycle didn't stop the wheel from turning. The Lutez twins understood this better than anyone. They existed across timelines, seeing all possibilities simultaneously, treating reality as a laboratory and people as experimental subjects. Their cryptic guidance and their manipulation of Booker through multiple attempts to stop Comstock suggested that they knew the truth, constants and variables, patterns that repeated across infinite possibilities. There's always a lighthouse, always a threshold, always a portal, always a gateway between worlds or down to depths. The lighthouse was the constant, the point of transition, the place where choices were made and realities diverged. There's always a man, always someone seeking redemption or power, always a protagonist who was also an antagonist, always the same person making different choices. There's always a city, always an impossible place built on absolute ideology, always a utopia that became dystopia, always a beautiful lie concealing ugly truth. And perhaps the deepest truth was that both cities failed for the same reason. They were built on the premise that humanity could be perfected through systems, that the right ideology correctly applied would create paradise. Ryan's objectivism, Comstock's religious nationalism, Lamb's collectivism, all of them treated people as abstractions, as pieces to be arranged according to theory. But people are not abstractions. They are complex, contradictory, capable of both extraordinary compassion and casual cruelty. The Splicers were not failures of individuals, but failures of a system that gave them power without wisdom, freedom without responsibility. The founders were not exceptional monsters, but ordinary people who had been taught that their superiority was divine will. The Vox Populi were not inherently better than those they fought, just differently positioned in the power structure. Rapture and Columbia both fell because they denied human complexity, because they tried to create societies based on single truths. And in the ruins of both cities, the survivors were those who had learned to exist in the gray spaces between ideological absolutes. Tenenbaum, who discovered guilt and redemption. Grace Holloway, who created community from necessity. Eleanor, who combined power with compassion because Delta had shown her it was possible. The artifacts scattered through both cities told stories of ordinary people crushed by extraordinary systems. Audio diaries revealed lives of quiet desperation, moral compromises, slow corruption, a woman who sold her voice to pay for Adam addiction, a man who justified torturing children because the research was important, an artist who descended into madness because beauty without constraint became horror. These were not monsters, but people who had normalized atrocity, who had accepted the logic of systems that treated humans as resources. Even the architecture told the story. Rapture's Art Deco elegance was based on the idea that form should express function, that beauty and efficiency were the same thing, a very objectivist notion. But the city's decay revealed the lie. The beautiful facades concealed pipes carrying corpses to furnaces, advertised ement, posters for plasmids that promised transcendence and delivered addiction, ballrooms where the elite had danced while workers suffered below. Columbia's neoclassical grandeur was based on the idea that America's past was glorious and should be emulated, a very nationalist notion. But the monuments to the founders were built by exploited labor. The shrines to Washington and Jefferson ignored that those men had owned slaves. The celebrations of American expansion glossed over the genocide of Native Americans. The beauty was real, but it was beauty built on atrocity, elegance purchased with suffering. The plasmids and vigors were the most perfect metaphors for both cities' philosophies. They offered transcendence, the ability to reshape reality through will alone, to become more than human. But they required Adam, which meant they required harvesting something precious from the vulnerable. Power in Rapture and Columbia always came at someone else's cost, and the cost was always paid by those least able to bear it. Jack, Delta, and Booker were all fathers in some sense, all trying to save daughters from systems that had claimed them. Jack saved or harvested the little sisters, becoming a father figure to them through choice. Delta was bonded to Eleanor, their relationship programmed but genuine. Booker was literally Elizabeth's father, though he had sold her and then hunted himself across timelines to get her back. The father-daughter relationship became the emotional core of all three stories, the human connection that persisted despite ideology and system. In cities built on grand theories about society, the most powerful force was the simple bond between parent and child, the willingness to sacrifice for someone you loved. And in the end, what destroyed both cities was not external force, but internal contradiction. Rapture fell because unchecked freedom became predation, because the strong devoured the weak, until there was nothing left but monsters fighting in ruins. Columbia fell because unchecked certainty became tyranny, because absolute conviction and righteousness justified any atrocity, until revolution became inevitable. Both cities were warnings, though it's unclear if anyone learned the lesson. They showed what happens when ideology trumps humanity, when systems matter more than people, when the pursuit of utopia justifies any cost. Ryan and Comstock both believed they were creating paradise. And in a sense, they succeeded. They created exactly what their philosophies predicted. The horror was that their philosophies were flawed from conception. Beautiful theories that ignored human reality. The question both cities asked was ultimately the same. Can human nature be perfected through the right system? And the answer, written in ruins beneath the ocean and collapsed across timelines in the sky, was clearly no. Human nature cannot be perfected because human nature is not a flaw to be corrected, but a complexity to be accepted. The survivors, Jack sailing away with saved little sisters, Eleanor escaping Rapture with Delta's consciousness within her, the timeline where Anna lived without Columbia, all suggested that redemption was possible, but not through grand systems or perfect ideologies. Redemption came through individual choices, through compassion exercised in specific moments, through the decision to save rather than harvest, to share consciousness rather than cling to life, to drown rather than let the cycle continue. In the end, there is always the lighthouse. The structure stands at the boundary between known and unknown, between surface and depth, between one reality and another. It is both warning and invitation, both guardian and gateway. The lighthouses in this story, the one in the Atlantic that led to Rapture, the one in the clouds that housed the rocket to Columbia, were thresholds where ordinary people became something else, where the world's rules changed. Jack climbed into a bathysphere not knowing he was descending to meet his father and his death and his apotheosis. Booker climbed into a rocket chair not knowing he was ascending to meet his daughter and his past and his other self. Delta woke in the ocean depths, already transformed, already enslaved, already dead in every way that mattered except the one that did. The lighthouse represents the moment of choice, though in Rapture and Columbia, choice itself was often illusory. Jack thought he chose to help Atlas, but would you kindly stripped away volition? Booker thought he chose to rescue Elizabeth, but the Ludices had orchestrated his arrival across multiple timelines. Delta had no choice at all, bonded to Eleanor by science that overwrote free will. Yet in the absence of real choice, these men created meaning through action. Jack choosing to save little sisters, even when harvesting them, would have been easier. Delta protecting Eleanor even when the bond compelled him, making the programming into genuine care. Booker accepting death at the baptism, allowing his daughter to erase him rather than clinging to existence. The cities themselves, Rapture and Columbia, were lighthouses in their own way, beacons that promised something better, a light in darkness or in clouds that called out to those dissatisfied with the world as it was. Come to Rapture, Ryan's advertisement promised, and be free. Come to Columbia, Comstock's vision offered, and be righteous. But lighthouses serve two purposes. They guide ships safely to harbor, and they warn ships away from rocks. Rapture and Columbia were warnings disguised as invitations, rocks hidden beneath beautiful light. Those who came seeking freedom found slavery to Adam addiction. Those who came seeking righteousness found themselves enforcers of tyranny. The tragedy was that the promises were not entirely false. Rapture really did offer freedom from surface governments, from taxation, from ethical constraint. Columbia really did offer a form of righteousness, a clear moral framework where good and evil were sharply defined. But freedom without ethics became chaos, and righteousness without doubt became fascism. and both cities fell into the ocean, literal or metaphorical. Perhaps the real lighthouse, the real warning, was Elizabeth herself. She existed at the intersection of all timelines, able to see infinite possibilities, able to open doors to worlds that might have been. She was the lighthouse made flesh, a beacon showing the way and warning of danger simultaneously. And her choice to extinguish herself, to erase her own power by preventing her own creation, was the ultimate act of responsibility. She saw what her powers could create. Columbia raining fire on New York, Rapture harvesting children forever, the cycles of violence and ideology repeating endlessly across infinite realities, and she chose to end it even though it meant ending herself. The lighthouse extinguished its own light to prevent false guidance. In the ruins of both cities, if you listen carefully beneath the sound of water dripping or wind howling through broken walls, you might hear the echoes of what they could have been. Rapture might have been a place where innovation truly flourished, where artists created without fear, where scientists pursued knowledge for its own sake. Columbia might have been a city that genuinely embodied American ideals of freedom and equality, a beacon of hope visible from the ground. But they were not these things, could never be these things, because they were built on foundations that denied human complexity. And so they fell, leaving behind only stories and warnings and the ghosts of people who had believed in impossible dreams. The lighthouse stands. It always stands, waiting for the next person who thinks they can build paradise, who believes their ideology is perfect, who is certain they have the answer. And the lighthouse warns them, if they would only listen. There are rocks beneath these waves. There is nothing solid in these clouds. There is no utopia except in the space between absolutes, in the gray area where human beings actually exist. Would you kindly remember that? Would you kindly learn from Rapture's ruins and Columbia's erased timeline? Would you kindly understand that the pursuit of perfect systems creates imperfect hells? That the only redemption lies in individual choices to be better than our programming, our ideology, our certainties? The lighthouse stands, and the question remains, will we see it as warning or invitation? Will we descend into new depths or ascend into new clouds, chasing the same impossible dreams that destroyed these impossible cities? There's always a lighthouse. There's always a man. There's always a city. The constants persist. The variables change. The story continues. Written in water and air, in the deep and the high, in the places where human ambition builds monuments to its own destruction and calls them paradise. And somewhere, in a timeline that may or may not exist, a girl named Anna lives with her father in a small apartment, and they are happy. And the ocean keeps its secrets, and the clouds drift on, and the cities that might have been remain mercifully unbuilt. Nothing but dreams from which we woke before the nightmare could begin. But that is only one possibility among infinite variations, and the lighthouse stands, and the choice remains, and the story is never truly finished. Would you kindly remember there are stories that exist in the margins, in the spaces between Jack's descent and Delta's resurrection, between Columbia's fall and Elizabeth's final sacrifice. These are the tales that the main narrative couldn't hold. The voices that spoke into audio diaries and were never heard. The choices that created ripples across realities too small to register in the grand sweep of lighthouse and city and drowning. Let us speak of them now, these ghosts in the machine, these lives that mattered even though history such as it was in places outside history forgot them. Dr. Bridget Tenenbaum's transformation from monster to savior was not instantaneous, not the sudden revelation that a single moment might suggest. She had been a child in a concentration camp, selected for survival by a Nazi doctor who saw potential in her absolute lack of sentiment. When the other children cried, young Bridget watched. When they died, she dissected them, clinically interested in the mechanisms of mortality. The camps taught her that morality was a luxury for those who could afford it, and she could not afford it. Survival meant suppressing empathy, meant treating human bodies as resources, meant asking how without ever considering whether. When the camps were liberated, she carried this lesson into her new life. First in Russia, and then, when Stalin's purges threatened to consume her, to Rapture. In Ryan City, she found the perfect environment for her particular genius. No ethics committees, no oversight, no squeamish administrators demanding justification for experiments. Su Chong was her colleague, though she despised his crudeness, his lack of elegance. Where she dissected with precision, he hacked with enthusiasm. Where she documented meticulously, he rushed toward results. Together, they created the Little Sisters, and Tenenbaum felt nothing. These were not children. They were vessels, delivery systems for atom production, the surgery that implanted the sea slugs, the conditioning that made them ignore their own humanity, the mental programming that transformed them into harvesters. All of this was simply applied science, no different from any other research. But something happened that Tenenbaum's conditioning hadn't prepared her for. She saw a little sister stop to look at a flower growing in one of Arcadia's gardens. A real flower, not the plastic decorations that littered Rapture. The child's face, barely visible beneath the helmet, showed wonder, pure and uncomplicated, the kind of emotion Tenenbaum thought she'd destroyed in them. It was such a small thing, a child looking at a flower. But it cracked something in Tenenbaum that the camps had sealed, allowed something she'd thought dead to stir. She began watching the Little Sisters differently, seeing past the modifications to the children trapped inside. She listened to their sing-song voices, "Angels! We found angels!" and heard the desperation beneath the programming. When she finally created the cure, the plasmid that could reverse the conditioning and restore the girls to something approaching normal, she told herself it was scientific curiosity, an experiment in reversal. But she knew, deep in the place where guilt lived, that it was penance. She could not undo the camps, could not resurrect the children she'd helped murder in the name of survival. But she could save these children, these little sisters, these girls who sang about angels while harvesting corpses in the dark. The audio diaries she left scattered through Rapture told this story in fragments, a confession distributed across the city like atoms scattered from a corpse. She needed Jack to hear them, needed someone to understand that monsters could remember they were human, that the capacity for change persisted even in souls as damaged as hers. When Jack chose to save the Little Sisters, to use her cure rather than harvesting them, Tenenbaum felt something she had not felt since childhood, before the camps, before the world taught her that compassion was weakness. Hope. Not hope for Rapture that was already doomed, but hope that people could choose to be better than their programming, better than their circumstances, better than the philosophies that created them. She would escape Rapture with the saved Little Sisters, would raise them as best she could, would spend the rest of her life trying to give them the childhood that had been stolen. It would never be enough, could never balance the scales, but it was what she could do, and so she did it. Daisy Fitzroy had not set out to become a killer. She had come to Columbia as a servant, grateful for employment in the floating city, believing the promises about opportunity and merit. She cleaned the Comstock house, invisible as all servants were to their employers, and she said nothing when she saw how Columbia treated people who looked like her. She said nothing when she was paid less than white servants for the same work. Said nothing when she had to use separate facilities, sit in separate areas, exist in a separate Columbia from the one the propaganda celebrated. She said nothing because silence was survival, because speaking up meant being cast down to the surface world below, back to a country that was hardly better. Then Lady Comstock was murdered, and Fitzroy was framed for it. The ease with which they blamed her, a black servant, practically invisible until needed, as a scapegoat revealed everything about Columbia's reality beneath its beautiful facade. She fled to Shantytown, to the slums where the people Columbia exploited lived in squalor while the city floated above them on their labor. In Shantytown, Fitzroy found others like her, Irish workers, black laborers, Chinese immigrants, all the people who built Columbia but could never truly be part of it. And she found rage, not just her own, but collective rage, the accumulated fury of people told they were inferior while producing everything that made the city possible. The Vox Populi began as resistance, as organization, as the voice of the people demanding recognition. Fitzroy became their leader not because she sought power, but because she articulated what they all felt: that Columbia's beauty was a lie, that the founders' righteousness was hypocrisy, that the entire system was designed to elevate some by crushing others. But resistance became revolution, and revolution became war, and war demanded compromises. To fight the founders, the Vox needed weapons, and weapons meant dealing with Jeremiah Fink, meant accepting arms from the very industrialist who exploited them. To motivate followers, Fitzroy needed passion, and passion meant rhetoric that grew increasingly extreme, promises of vengeance that went beyond justice. She watched herself transform from liberator to tyrant, saw her followers commit atrocities in the name of freedom, witnessed the revolution devolve into mob violence that killed the innocent alongside the guilty. When Vox soldiers murdered children from founder families, Fitzroy knew she had become what she fought against, someone willing to sacrifice humanity for ideology. The Elizabeth who confronted her in Finkton saw a monster, and perhaps that's what Fitzroy had become. But she was a monster created by Columbia's sins, shaped by a system that left no room for peaceful change, forced into extremism by a society that treated moderation as weakness and compassion as betrayal. Her death, whether by Elizabeth's hand or through other means depending on the timeline, was almost a relief. She had started a fire she couldn't control, unleashed violence she couldn't contain. Better to die believing the revolution might still mean something than to live and watch it become another tyranny, the oppressed becoming oppressors in an endless cycle. In her final moments, Fitzroy thought not of Columbia or the founders or even the Vox, but of the young woman she'd been, the servant who had believed that hard work and dignity would be enough, who had thought justice might be possible without bloodshed. That woman was dead, killed by Columbia as surely as if they'd executed her, and what remained was just a ghost wearing her face, a ghost that whispered uncomfortable truths about what oppression created when it pressed too hard for too long. The artist Madness Sander Cohen had been acclaimed on the surface, a genius of music and theater. His works performed to standing ovations in New York and Paris. But acclaim was not enough for Cohen, never enough, because he saw in audiences and critics the same flaw. They appreciated his art, but did not understand it, not truly, not the way he needed them to. Rapture promised understanding. In Ryan City, Cohen would find an audience worthy of his genius, people who had transcended the mediocrity of surface life. He established himself in Fort Frolic, the entertainment district, and for a time, it was everything he'd hoped. He composed symphonies that pushed boundaries, directed plays that would have been censored above, created art that existed purely for its own sake. But the Civil War changed everything, or perhaps it revealed what had always been there. The atom that Cohen spliced into his system didn't create his madness, it amplified something that had always existed. A narcissism so complete that other people ceased to be real to him. They became instruments, tools, materials to be shaped into his vision. His dancers, his students, his protégés. Cohen murdered them and called it art. He plastered their corpses to walls, arranged them in tableaus, set them to music boxes that played his compositions. When they moved, when the bodies twitched and shambled as splicers, he found it beautiful, found in their grotesque dance the perfect expression of his aesthetic. Fort Frolic became his gallery, his museum, his masterwork. Every surface displayed his obsessions, his genius, his complete break from reality. He recorded audio diaries that veered between lucidity and gibberish, between profound artistic insight and murderous paranoia. He demanded perfection from his disciples and punished imperfection with death, unable to see that he was creating nothing but horror. When Jack passed through Fort Frolic, Cohen saw him as another instrument, another piece to be incorporated into the grand work. The tasks Cohen set, photographing his murdered disciples, retrieving items from the corpses of his former proteges, were not sadism for its own sake, but Cohen's genuine belief that he was creating meaning, imposing order and beauty on chaos. The tragedy of Sander Cohen was that his genius was real. The compositions that played through Fort Frolic were genuinely brilliant, haunting melodies that would have been masterworks in any other context. But brilliance without empathy, creativity without conscience, art without humanity, these things created only beautiful nightmares. In some timelines, Jack killed Cohen, ending the artist's madness with bullets. In others, Cohen survived, continuing to create in his gallery of corpses, speaking to disciples long dead, conducting orchestras that existed only in his fractured mind. Whether dead or alive, Cohen remained trapped in Fort Frolic, unable to escape the masterwork he had created from human suffering. He died as he lived alone, surrounded by his art, convinced of his own genius, completely unable to see that he had transformed beauty into atrocity. His final words, recorded in an audio diary found years later by Delta, were a composition title, Symphony in Flesh and Stone, a masterwork. The symphony played on in Fort Frolic's halls, a beautiful melody underscoring unspeakable horror. The businessman's bargain Jeremiah Fink believed in profit the way Ryan believed in objectivism, absolutely, without reservation, with the conviction that economic self-interest would solve all problems if allowed to operate without constraint. He had come to Columbia as an industrialist and thrived, building an empire on the backs of workers he paid in scrip that could only be spent in his company stores, on housing he rented at exorbitant rates, on products he sold at marked up prices. Finkton was his creation, a district where workers lived and died without ever escaping his economic ecosystem. They couldn't afford to leave, couldn't save enough to escape, couldn't organize because Fink controlled everything, including the security forces that suppressed union activity. It was capitalism distilled to its purest form, and Fink saw it as beautiful, elegant, the market operating exactly as it should. But Fink had a secret that even Ryan's most devoted objectivists would have found disturbing. His technological advantages came from cheating. Using tears in reality that Rosalind Lutece had discovered, Fink spied on Rapture, stealing innovations from a city decades in the future. The plasmids that Souchong and Tenenbaum would invent in the 1950s appeared in Columbia in the 1910s as vigors because Fink had copied them across time. He felt no guilt about this intellectual theft, saw it merely as leveraging available resources. The technology existed, he was simply accessing it through unconventional means. That it hadn't been invented yet in his timeline was irrelevant profit, recognized no temporal boundaries. The workers who died in his factories, who were transformed into handymen when injuries made them useless for normal labor, who lived in poverty while producing his wealth. Fink saw these as acceptable costs of business. He recorded audio diaries explaining his philosophy with genuine conviction, believing that he was actually helping these people by employing them, that without his factories they would starve. When the Vox Populi rose against him, Fink was genuinely bewildered. He had provided jobs, had created an economic system that functioned, had generated wealth, that the wealth flowed primarily to him, while workers died in poverty, struck him as irrelevant. He had taken the risks, provided the capital, made the innovations stolen, though they were. By the logic of his philosophy, he deserved the rewards. His death came during the revolution, torn apart by the workers he'd exploited, his final moments spent not in regret, but in incomprehension. He could not understand why they were angry, why providing subsistence-level employment wasn't enough, why profit alone didn't justify any action. His last audio diary, recorded as the Vox broke through his defenses, listed his accomplishments and contributions. A man defending himself to history with balance sheets and productivity metrics. Fink's legacy was Finkton itself, a monument to the proposition that economic freedom without ethical constraint created systematic cruelty, that the invisible hand of the market sometimes strangled rather than guided. His workers inherited his factories and his wealth, and then burned both, finding more satisfaction in the destruction of what had oppressed them than in perpetuating the system under new management. The soldiers sacrificed Cornelius Slate had been a true believer once, a soldier who fought for America and then for Columbia with equal conviction. He had stood beside Comstock at Wounded Knee and in the Boxer Rebellion, had spilled blood for his country and his prophet, had believed the narrative about American exceptionalism and divine mission. But Comstock's Columbia was built on lies, and Slate knew this because he had lived the truth. The Hall of Heroes, designed to commemorate Columbia's military victories, sanitized those events into propaganda. The exhibit about Wounded Knee didn't mention that they'd massacred women and children. The Boxer Rebellion display transformed slaughter into heroism, turned Slate's nightmares into triumphant tableaus. Worse, Comstock rewrote himself into these events as the hero, diminishing or erasing the actual soldiers who had fought. Slate watched his own accomplishments attributed to the prophet, his own trauma transformed into another man's glory, his own guilt over Wounded Knee repackaged as righteous violence. The betrayal broke something in Slate. He was a soldier, understood hierarchy and command, but he also understood honor, and Comstock had none. The prophet had used his soldiers, taking credit for their sacrifices, and then discarded them when they became inconvenient reminders of ugly truths. So Slate seized the Hall of Heroes with his most loyal men, 1st Regiment veterans who shared his disillusionment. They barricaded themselves inside, demanding that Comstock face them, that the prophet prove himself in combat rather than hiding behind propaganda and police. But Comstock sent DeWitt instead, and Slate saw in this outsider something he recognized: another soldier, another man with blood on his hands, another person carrying Wounded Knee's weight. The fight between DeWitt and Slate's men was brutal, desperate, but Slate welcomed it. He and his soldiers wanted a warrior's death, wanted to die in combat rather than fade into obscurity or become footnotes in Comstock's fabricated history. When DeWitt finally reached Slate, the old soldier was almost grateful. He begged for death, for the honor of dying in battle, for an end that meant something. Whether DeWitt granted that request or simply moved on, the result was the same. Slate and his 1st Regiment died in the Hall of Heroes, their bodies becoming part of the very monument they had tried to reclaim. In death, Slate achieved a strange victory. The truth he represented, that Comstock was a fraud, that Columbia's glory was built on lies, that propaganda couldn't completely erase reality, persisted in the hall itself. Future visitors would see Slate's barricades, would encounter his audio diaries explaining his rebellion, would question the official narrative. It wasn't the vindication he'd sought, but it was something. Proof that even in Columbia, even in a city built on absolute certainty and perfect control, truth could persist in the margins, in the spaces between official stories, in the voices of those who refuse to forget. The twins outside, Time Rosalind and Robert Lutece, existed in a state that defied conventional understanding of reality, consciousness, or death. They were scientists. Twins, though. Robert was actually Rosalind's male counterpart from a parallel timeline, and they had discovered the fundamental mechanics of reality itself. Rosalind had been the brilliant physicist who made Columbia possible, who had discovered the quantum principles that allowed the city to float, who had opened the first tears in reality and glimpsed infinite possibilities. Robert had been her first successful retrieval from another timeline, proof that the multiverse existed and could be navigated. They had worked for Comstock, had helped him steal baby Anna, had been complicit in the creation of Columbia's greatest sin. And when Comstock, paranoid about what they knew, arranged their murder, a bomb, disguised as an experiment gone wrong, death had not been the end. Because they existed simultaneously across all timelines, because they had so thoroughly entangled themselves with quantum possibility, death simply meant existing in all moments at once. They could appear anywhere in Columbia's history, could witness every possibility, could observe the same events from infinite angles. This should have driven them mad, but instead it gave them clarity. They saw the pattern. Booker always came, Elizabeth was always stolen, Columbia always fell or was erased. They saw themselves creating the problem and being unable to fix it, through normal causality. So they began to experiment with different approaches, bringing different versions of Booker to Columbia across 122 attempts, learning what worked and what failed. Their dialogue was cryptic because they spoke across timelines, finishing each other's sentences from different possibilities, referencing events that hadn't happened yet or had been erased. They treated people as experimental subjects because, from their perspective, outside time, people were experimental subjects, variables to be adjusted, constants to be identified, data points in the grand equation. Yet they retained enough humanity to feel guilt, to want to undo their mistake, to spend eternity trying to prevent the harm they'd caused. Their help to Booker and Elizabeth was genuine, even when it seemed manipulative, because they understood that free will and determinism were both true from different perspectives. In the final timeline, when Elizabeth drowned Booker and erased Comstock, the Luteces presumably ceased to exist as well. The quantum entanglement that sustained them would have collapsed with Columbia's erasure. Or perhaps they persisted, observing the timelines that remained, satisfied that they had finally solved the equation, even if the solution required their own elimination from it. Their final audio diary, left for no one because everyone who might hear it would cease to exist, simply said, "The debt is paid." It was simultaneously an apology, a completion, and an acceptance they had created horror and had spent eternity trying to undo it. And finally, mercifully, the experiment was over. The children who remained the little sisters who survived Jack's arrival, whether saved or created after his departure, inherited a rapture even more broken than before. They huddled together in forgotten corners, harvesting Adam from corpses with decreasing enthusiasm, their sing-song voices growing quieter in the darkness. Some had been saved by Jack and took with Tenenbaum to the surface, given antidote that gradually restored their humanity. These girls would grow up haunted by fragmented memories of being little sisters, of harvesting corpses, of big daddies dying to protect them. They would have nightmares about needles and sea slugs, would flinch from the color yellow that reminded them of their eyes, would struggle to explain to therapists trauma that existed outside normal experience. Others remained in rapture, either because Jack had harvested them in some timelines or because they had been created after his departure. These children adapted to the ruins, becoming feral in ways that transcended even their conditioning. They formed packs, protecting each other without big daddies, developing their own social structures in the darkness. Eleanor would find some of them during her escape from Rapture, would try to save as many as she could. But Rapture was vast and ruined, and some little sisters disappeared into flooded sections or sealed corridors, never to be found. They became myths, ghosts in the deep, occasionally glimpsed by splicers who still retained enough sanity to fear what they saw. One little sister, designation unknown, recorded an audio diary on equipment she scavenged. Her voice was small, sing-song, but the words were her own, not conditioning. "Mr. Bubbles isn't coming. Sister said he's sleeping forever. But it's okay. We find angels ourselves now. We share the pretty red stuff. We take care of each other like Mr. Bubbles took care of us. Someday maybe we go up, up, up to where the sun is. But not yet. Rapture needs us. The angels need us. We're still needed." The diary cut off with sounds of combat, of splicers attacking, of a child screaming. Whether she survived was unknown, lost in Rapture's chaos. But the recording persisted, a testament to resilience, to children finding family in horror, to human connection surviving even in the deepest dark. These were the forgotten victims, the costs that didn't make it into anyone's philosophical debate about objectivism or collectivism. They were children who had been transformed into tools, who had lost years to conditioning and Adam addiction, whose childhoods had been stolen to fuel Ryan's dream and Fontaine's ambition. Some would heal. Others would carry Rapture inside them forever, the slug in their stomachs, a permanent reminder, the memories of harvesting corpses unerasable. All of them would know that adults built beautiful dreams and then fed children to those dreams when the beauty began to crack. Let us descend once more into Rapture, not to Jack's 1960 or Delta's 1968, but to the time between, When the city existed in a liminal state, Ryan dead but his philosophy living on, Fontaine defeated but his legacy metastasizing, the Little Sisters still harvesting, but Tenenbaum's cure spreading slowly through the ruins. This was Rapture in purgatory, neither alive nor fully dead, sustained by the geothermal vents and the desperate stubbornness of those who refused to abandon it. Some residents still believed salvation was possible, that Ryan's dream could be recovered if they just eliminated the parasites, if they just spliced the right plasmids, if they just found enough Adam. Others knew better, but stayed anyway, because where else could they go? The surface world believed Rapture was a myth, and even if they could reach it, what would they say? I've been living in an underwater city for the past decade, participating in a civil war, harvesting genetic material from corpses. They were trapped not by the ocean, but by the impossibility of explaining what they'd become. The splicers, those most transformed by Adam, developed a society of sorts in the ruins. They gathered in tribes around particularly generous corpse deposits, fighting territorial wars over harvesting rights. They decorated their spaces with debris and bodies, creating shrines to their addictions, altars to the power they'd sacrificed their humanity to obtain. Some splicers retained enough consciousness to record audio diaries, their thoughts fractured but still present. A woman who had been a stage actress spoke into a recorder she'd found, her voice shifting between her own and dozens of characters she'd played. Is it Tuesday? It's always Tuesday in Rapture. Or maybe it's Thursday, the ocean doesn't care about calendars. I need more lightning, need to feel it in my hands, need to be the storm. Once I played Electra, no, that was someone else, someone who looked like me before the pretty red medicine. Did I have children? There's a photograph, but the faces are blurred. Sometimes I see little girls and I think they're mine, but then they're angels with needles, and Mr. Bubbles makes me go away. The show must go on. Is it my line? Is it Tuesday? The diary continued for several more minutes, lucidity and madness trading places, before ending abruptly with sounds of violence. This was Rapture's daily reality, fragments of humanity persisting in minds ravaged by genetic modification, people who were simultaneously victims and monsters, trapped in a hell they'd chosen one splice at a time. The architect's regret. Augustus Sinclair, who would later guide Delta through Rapture, had a history in the city that predated the Civil War. He had been Ryan's friend once, or as close to a friend as Ryan allowed, a business partner who understood objectivism and practiced it with shameless enthusiasm. Where Ryan built Rapture from ideology, Sinclair saw opportunity, and he exploited it magnificently. Sinclair's solutions had fingerprints everywhere in Rapture. He'd provided services during construction, sold goods during prosperity, and profited from decline by offering increasingly desperate solutions to increasingly desperate problems. When splicers needed Adam, Sinclair sold it. When they needed plasmids, Sinclair provided them. When the Little Sisters needed big daddies, Sinclair's company handled the conditioning. He recorded his philosophy in audio diaries with good-natured cynicism, always aware of the moral compromises, but proceeding anyway, because this was Rapture, and Rapture was built on the principle that self-interest justified everything. He was honest about his exploitation in a way that Ryan never was. Sinclair knew he was profiting from suffering and felt no need to dress it up in philosophical justification. But something shifted when he encountered Subject Delta and Eleanor. Perhaps it was seeing genuine connection in a city that had commodified every relationship. Perhaps it was witnessing sacrifice that served no self-interest. Perhaps it was simply that even Sinclair had limits, and watching Sophia Lamb attempt to destroy her own daughter's personality crossed them. He helped Delta save Eleanor, provided resources and information, and in doing so performed the first genuinely altruistic act of his life. They cost him, Lamb's followers killed him for his betrayal, and he died in Fontaine Futuristics, alone in the dark, blood pooling beneath him. His final audio diary was remarkably clear-headed for a dying man. Well, Augustus, you always said you'd die rich, and here you are, dying in the richest city ever built. Except it's all gone now, isn't it? The money's worthless, the city's sinking, and the only thing I've got left is knowing I helped that little girl get free. Funny how that feels like it's worth more than everything else combined. Must be the blood loss talking. Sinclair's redemption was incomplete, bought at the last possible moment, motivated perhaps more by contempt for Lamb than genuine virtue. But it was still redemption, proof that even in Rapture, even among those who had profited most from its sins, change remained possible. He died knowing he'd done something that served no profit margin, no self-interest, no objective value, and finding that it mattered anyway. The child who remembered. Eleanor Lamb's existence was paradox layered upon paradox. She was bonded to Subject Delta through Suchong's science, creating a connection that should have been purely mechanical, but somehow transcended its programming. She was Sophia Lamb's daughter, raised with collectivist ideology, taught that the self was sin and the common good was everything. She was a little sister who had never harvested, modified but not lost, powerful beyond any normal child, but still, somehow, human. Her years in a coma while Delta was dead were not empty. Through the Little Sister network, all the girls mentally connected through their sea slugs, Eleanor experienced Rapture from hundreds of perspectives simultaneously. She felt what every little sister felt, saw what they saw, harvested corpses through their hands, was protected by big daddies through their bond. This collective consciousness should have destroyed her individuality, should have proven her mother's theories correct. Instead, it taught Eleanor the opposite lesson, that even forced into a collective, even sharing consciousness, the little sisters remained individuals. Each had her own personality, her own fears, her own way of coping with horror. The collective didn't erase the self, it revealed that the self persisted even when everything was done to destroy it. When Eleanor woke and called Delta back from death, she wielded power that terrified her mother. Not just the ability to control Rapture's systems or to force other minds to obey, but the strength to remain herself despite everything designed to erase her. Sophia Lamb saw contamination. Eleanor experienced it as love. The bond with Delta, which Lamb had tried to sever, had preserved Eleanor's humanity precisely because it was a connection to someone who saw her as an individual, not as a vessel or a tool. Delta's influence on Eleanor depended on his choices, whether he harvested or saved little sisters, whether he showed mercy or brutality, whether he chose power or compassion. Eleanor absorbed all of it through their bond, learning morality from example rather than ideology. This was perhaps the most radical thing in Rapture. A child developing ethics not from philosophy imposed from above, but from witnessing actions and their consequences. If Delta harvested, Eleanor learned that power justified any action, that the strong should consume the weak, that Ryan's objectivism taken to its extreme created monsters. If Delta saved, Eleanor learned that strength could protect rather than exploit, that self-interest could coexist with compassion, that individual choice mattered precisely because it didn't have to be selfish. When Eleanor finally escaped Rapture, taking saved little sisters with her and carrying Delta's consciousness within her own mind, she brought with her knowledge that neither Ryan nor Lamb could have accepted, that ideologies failed when they tried to reduce people to abstractions, that the answer to Rapture's failure wasn't Columbia's opposite, but something more complex, individual choice exercised with awareness of collective impact, freedom tempered by responsibility, strength used to protect rather than dominate. She would live on the surface with ghosts inside her Delta's memories, the little sister's shared trauma, her mother's failed philosophy. But she would live, and she would be herself. And in a city built on the premise that the self should be either absolute or abolished, that alone was revolutionary. Now we must step outside chronology entirely and examine the pattern that connects Rapture and Columbia, the constants that persist across all variables, the structure beneath the story. Both cities were founded by men who had witnessed horror and drawn opposite conclusions. Ryan saw collectivism as the ultimate evil and built a city on absolute individualism. Comstock saw moral ambiguity as weakness and built a city on absolute certainty. Both men created utopias that became dystopias because they refused to acknowledge human complexity. Both cities featured father-daughter relationships as their emotional core, but twisted through ideology and circumstance. Ryan never acknowledged Jack as his son, reducing fatherhood to genetics, a key that opened locks but meant nothing emotionally. Comstock stole Elizabeth, reducing fatherhood to ownership. A daughter as property to be shaped into a weapon. Delta and Eleanor had the most genuine parent-child bond, but it was created through science that was supposed to erase humanity, succeeding despite its design. Both cities created systems to exploit children for power. Rapture had its little sisters harvesting Adam from corpses. Columbia had Elizabeth imprisoned to weaponize her abilities. Both justified this exploitation through ideology. Rapture called it freedom of science. Columbia called it divine will, but the result was the same: childhood stolen and commodified. Both cities fell not to external force, but to internal contradiction. Rapture's absolute freedom without ethics created Adam addiction and civil war. Columbia's absolute certainty without doubt created oppression and revolution. The Vox Populi's rebellion against the founders mirrored Ryan's war against Atlas, proving that the oppressed would use the oppressor's methods when they seized power, that violence begat violence, regardless of which side wielded it. Both cities feature technology that shouldn't exist. Quantum mechanics made flesh. The plasmids and vigors allowed human evolution through injection. Power gained through genetic modification. The Lutece device opened tiers in reality, allowing access to infinite possibilities. Both technologies promised transcendence and delivered corruption, because power without wisdom simply created new ways to harm. Both cities had their truth-tellers who were ignored or punished. In Rapture, Diane McClintock warned about Ryan's increasing tyranny and was dismissed. In Columbia, Slate revealed Comstock's lies and was killed. Truth was dangerous in both cities because both were built on ideologies that couldn't survive contact with reality. Both cities had their audio diaries, fragments of perspective scattered through the ruins, voices speaking into recorders because there was no one left to listen. These diaries told the real story, not the grand philosophical narratives Ryan and Comstock promoted, but the small human experiences of people trying to survive systems designed to use them. The plasmids in Rapture and vigors in Columbia were literally the same technology, stolen across time through Fink's exploitation of the Lutece tiers. This created a direct connection between the cities, a technological lineage that suggested they were not separate experiments, but part of the same pattern. Humanity's recurring attempt to create paradise through ideology, failing each time but never learning the lesson. The Big Daddies and Songbird were both protectors transformed into symbols of oppression. The Big Daddies were men stripped of humanity to protect little sisters, their devotion programmed but somehow genuine. Songbird was a machine designed to protect Elizabeth, its love as real as programming could make it. Both died protecting their charges. Both were tragedies of connection, corrupted into control. Elizabeth's ability to open tiers in reality allowed her to connect the cities directly, to bring Rapture's bathyspheres into Columbia, to navigate between impossible places. She existed at the intersection of all possibilities, able to see that Rapture and Columbia were variations on the same theme, different expressions of the same human tendency to build beautiful prisons and call them paradise. The lighthouse constant, there's always a lighthouse, marked every threshold between normal reality and these impossible cities. Lighthouses should guide safely, but in BioShock, they led to places that destroyed those who entered. The lighthouse in the Atlantic led to Rapture's depths. The lighthouse in the clouds launched rockets to Columbia. Both were warnings disguised as invitations. Both promised something better and delivered horror. The man constant, there's always a man, meant that the same person made different choices across timelines and became completely different. Booker refused baptism and became a failure who sold his daughter. Booker accepted baptism and became Comstock, who stole his daughter. Both were Booker, both were the same man, but the choice at that single moment created wildly divergent paths. This was perhaps the deepest truth, that we are not one thing, but many possibilities. That identity is not fixed, but fluid. That a single choice can create entirely different people. Jack was designed to be a weapon, but chose to be a savior, or didn't, depending on his actions toward little sisters. Delta was programmed to be a machine, but retained enough humanity to love Eleanor. Booker was simultaneously victim and perpetrator, father and enemy, hero and villain. The city constant, there's always a city, meant that humanity would keep trying to create utopia, keep building impossible places, keep believing that the right system correctly applied would perfect human nature. Rapture failed, Columbia fell or was erased, but somewhere else, in another timeline or another reality, someone was probably building another city, convinced their ideology would succeed where all others had failed. This was the pattern, the constant across all variables. Idealism corrupted into tyranny. Freedom devolved into oppression. Utopia revealed as dystopia. Not because the original visions were insincere, but because they were incomplete. Because they tried to reduce human complexity to simple systems. Because they ignored everything that didn't fit their theories. There are narratives that exist in the margins of even these margins. People who lived and died in Rapture and Columbia, whose stories touched the main events but were never recorded, whose audio diaries were never found, whose choices mattered but were never witnessed. Think of the bathysphere operator who transported citizens between Rapture's districts during the Civil War, who saw everything but was invisible, who listened to conversations and kept silent, who knew where the bodies were buried because he transported some of them. He kept a journal in his bathysphere, writing by hand rather than recording audio, because he feared being overheard even by machines. His entries chronicled Rapture's fall. From a unique perspective, he saw Ryan's paranoia increase as he demanded private transport to secret locations, saw Fontaine's forces gathering as Atlas's men traveled in groups to hidden meetings, saw the Little Sisters and their big daddies moving through the city on their macabre errands, saw citizens disappearing one by one as the war consumed them. His final entry, found years later in a bathysphere drifting through flooded corridors, read, 20 years I've been diving between these districts. 20 years watching the greatest minds on Earth build paradise. 2 years watching them destroy it. Ryan's dead, Fontaine's dead, Atlas is really Fontaine, which means he's double dead, and I'm still here, floating in the dark, running a service nobody uses anymore. The irony is that I'm probably the freest person in Rapture now. No ideology, no side in the war, just me and my sphere. But freedom in a tomb is just a longer dying. I'm heading for the surface. Don't know if this will make it, don't know if I will either, but I have to try. Even dying in the sun beats living in the dark. The bathysphere was found empty, whether because the operator reached the surface or died trying remains unknown. But his journal survived, a testimony to all the ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances, who had no powers or plasmids or philosophy, just the daily choice to survive or surrender. Or consider the school teacher in Columbia, a woman who taught in the schools Ryan Amusements operated, trying to educate children in a system designed to indoctrinate them. She knew the propaganda was lies, knew the founders weren't saints, knew Columbia's history was sanitized, knew the entire curriculum was designed to create zealots rather than thinkers. But she also knew that if she deviated from the approved materials, she'd be reported, fired, possibly thrown off the city. So she taught the lies and tried to smuggle truth into the margins, asking questions that encouraged critical thinking, assigning essays that required students to examine contradictions, subtly undermining the very material she was required to teach. Her hidden diary, discovered after Columbia's fall, showed the weight this double life created. Today, I taught that the founders were chosen by God to lead the inferior races towards civilization. I showed the students paintings of Washington ascending to heaven like Christ. I played recordings of Comstock explaining divine will. And then, when no one was watching, I gave my brightest student a book band, smuggled from the surface about the real history of Wounded Knee. Tomorrow she'll either turn me in or she'll start to question. Everything I've done, all the compromise, all the lies I've told in service of the truth, I couldn't speak directly. It either matters tomorrow or it was all collaboration with a system I despise. I won't sleep tonight. I haven't really slept in years. The teacher disappeared during the Vox Populi uprising, her fate unknown. But several of her former students survived and spoke later about the woman who had taught them to think, even when thinking was dangerous, who had shown them that truth could hide inside lies, waiting to be discovered. These untold stories multiply across both cities. The maintenance worker who kept Columbia's quantum mechanics functioning without understanding the science, just following technical manuals, unaware that his routine repairs were keeping an entire city afloat. The cook in Kashmir restaurant who watched Rapture's elite dine on luxuries while workers starved, who spat in their food and called it revolution, who died alone during the Civil War and became just another corpse for the little sisters to harvest. The nurse in Fontaine Futuristics who assisted Suchong with his experiments, who held down struggling children while they were implanted with sea slugs, who told herself she was following orders, that she was helping science, that the ends justified means until the day she couldn't anymore, until she saw one more little sister's eyes cloud over with yellow and something inside her broke. She released every test subject she could access, including several big daddies, and then injected herself with a lethal dose of Adam. Her last audio diary, a confession. I told myself I was a healer. Nurses heal. But healers don't transform children into monsters. That's something else. And I've been that something else for 5 years. I can't fix what I've done. Can't save the girls I helped destroy. But I can stop doing it. I can release these prisoners. I can choose to die human rather than live as what I've become. It's not redemption, I'm beyond that, but it's something. It has to be something. Her body was found surrounded by empty cages, having freed dozens of test subjects before ending her own life. Whether this act balanced her years of complicity is unknowable, but it stands as testimony that even in systems designed to erase conscience, individual choice persisted, drowning in metaphor. Water is everywhere in these stories, pressing against glass, flooding corridors, surrounding cities, drowning fathers. The ocean outside Rapture's windows was both protection and threat, keeping the surface world away while constantly reminding residents that they lived at the bottom of the sea, that thousands of tons of pressure waited just beyond the glass, that one crack could flood everything. Baptism by drowning appears repeatedly. Comstock was born in baptism. Booker drowned at the baptismal font to prevent Comstock's existence. Delta drowned when Lamb forced him to shoot himself. Countless splicers drowned in flooded sections of Rapture. Water represents both cleansing and death, redemption and destruction, the same element serving opposite purposes. The bathyspheres that transported people through Rapture were wombs of metal and glass, carrying passengers through amniotic ocean, delivering them to new locations reborn. Jack descended in a bathysphere from surface to depths, a birth in reverse, entering Rapture innocent and emerging changed. The symbolism was almost too obvious. You couldn't enter these cities without transforming, without leaving your old self behind. Columbia avoided water by existing in clouds. But water still appeared in the baptisms that marked every citizen, in the tears Elizabeth cried, in the imagery of purification that Comstock used constantly. Even in the sky, water symbolism persisted, because these stories were fundamentally about drowning in ideology, in Adam, in certainty, in the weight of choices made. The sea slugs that produced Adam were bottom feeders, creatures that fed on death and decay, transforming corpses into power. This was Rapture's economy in biological form, value extracted from death, power derived from consumption, beauty fed by horror. The Little Sisters harvested Adam from corpses with needles, a more direct but essentially similar process. Fire opposed water in both cities. The plasmid. Incinerate allowed users to throw flames, creating steam when it met water, burning splicers in flooded rooms, evaporating the ocean that threatened to enter. In Columbia, vigors like Devil's Kiss provided fire, burning the righteous and unrighteous alike, purging without discernment. But fire didn't save either city. Rapture drowned slowly, sections flooding as the Civil War damaged infrastructure, water claiming more territory each day. Columbia burned, or was erased, depending on timeline. Fire and quantum dissolution, serving the same purpose, destruction, ending, the final answer to utopia's promises. The metaphor extended to choice itself, framed as fluid rather than fixed. Jack's decision to save or harvest little sisters, Delta's actions influencing Eleanor, Booker's moment at the baptismal font, all of these were presented as water rather than stone, flowing rather than fixed. Choices that rippled outward and changed everything they touched. Elizabeth's tears, in reality, were portals to other possibilities, ways to reach through the fabric of space-time and pull alternatives into the current timeline. They were windows, but they were also wounds, reality bleeding through tears, the multiverse leaking into the present, infinite possibilities pressing against the single moment. The tears showed that reality itself was fluid, that past and future and alternate timelines were not separate, but interpenetrating, that the boundaries between what was and what might be were permeable. This was the ultimate challenge to both Ryan's and Comstock's philosophies. They believed in fixed truths, in solid ground, but reality itself was fluid, shifting, refusing to be locked into single definitions. The price of certainty. Both Andrew Ryan and Zachary Hale Comstock were absolutely certain of their philosophies, their righteousness, their vision for human civilization. This certainty was their greatest strength and ultimate weakness, the foundation that built their cities and the flaw that destroyed them. Ryan's certainty about objectivism was so complete that he couldn't see its practical failures even as they accumulated around him. When people became addicted to Adam, he blamed their weakness rather than questioning whether absolute freedom might require some structure. When Fontaine's criminal empire grew, Ryan saw it as one bad actor rather than a systemic problem his philosophy created. When civil war erupted, he refused to acknowledge that unlimited freedom without ethical constraint might produce chaos. His final act, commanding Jack to kill him, was both the ultimate proof of his philosophy's failure and his stubborn adherence to it. He died proving that Jack was a slave, vindicating his belief that free will was paramount, yet missing entirely that he himself had become a dictator, that he had betrayed every principle he claimed to uphold, that his certainty had transformed him into exactly what he claimed to oppose. Comstock's certainty was even more dangerous because it claimed divine sanction. He didn't just believe he was right. He believed God had made him right, that his vision of Columbia came from revelation rather than reason. This made him immune to doubt, incapable of questioning whether burning the cities of Sodom below might be monstrous rather than righteous. His certainty allowed him to steal Anna and believe he was rescuing her, to imprison Elizabeth and call it protection, to plan genocide and name it purification. Because he was certain of his righteousness, no atrocity was too great. The ends justified any means because the ends were divine and the means were irrelevant. Sophia Lamb's certainty was different in form but identical in function. She was certain that individualism was evil, that the only salvation lay in collective consciousness, that Eleanor needed to be transformed into a vessel for human unity. Her certainty was dressed in psychological and philosophical language rather than religious revelation, but it served the same purpose, justifying terrible actions through appeal to higher truth. All three, Ryan, Comstock, Lamb, sacrificed people to their certainties, treated human beings as obstacles or resources in pursuit of absolute truth. And all three failed because human beings refused to cooperate with their theories, insisted on being complex and contradictory, on making choices that didn't fit the predetermined patterns. The heroes of these stories, Jack, Delta, Booker, Elizabeth, all faced uncertainty and chose to act anyway. Jack didn't know who he really was, but chose to save little sisters or not, based on immediate moral intuition. Delta didn't understand his bond with Eleanor, but protected her anyway. Booker didn't remember selling Anna, but sought redemption when he learned the truth. Elizabeth saw infinite possibilities and chose one path, despite knowing others existed. Uncertainty allowed them to make genuine choices, to change and grow, to become better than their programming or worse than their potential. Ryan, Comstock, and Lamb were static, unchanging, locked into their certainties even as those certainties destroyed everything they'd built. This was perhaps the fundamental lesson. That certainty itself was dangerous. That the moment You believed you had all the answers, you stopped asking questions. That ideologies became tyrannies when they claimed to be perfect. The healthiest position was perpetual uncertainty, constant questioning, willing to change when evidence demanded it. But this lesson was almost impossible to learn because uncertainty felt like weakness, like failure, like admission of defeat. Ryan, Comstock, and Lamb all preferred to die and to kill thousands rather than admit they might be wrong. Their certainty was armor against doubt, and when that armor was penetrated, they shattered rather than adapted. Now let me return, finally, to the children, because in the end, that's what these stories were about. Not grand philosophy or impressive technology or even the dramatic confrontations between fathers and daughters, but what happens to children in systems built by adults who valued ideology over innocence. The little sisters were the most obvious victims. Girls surgically modified and mentally conditioned to harvest Adam from corpses, their childhood stolen to fuel an economic system. But their victimization was not unique. It was simply the most visible manifestation of what both cities did to children. In Rapture, children were resources to be optimized. The Little Sisters were the extreme example, but there were also the youth programs that trained children in Ryan's objectivism, teaching them that compassion was weakness and selfishness was virtue. There were the educational recordings that dismissed altruism as a con, that positioned helping others as betraying yourself. A child raised in Rapture before the fall would learn that they owed nothing to anyone, that they should maximize their own advantage regardless of cost to others, that achievement justified any action. They would grow up emotionally stunted, unable to form genuine connections, trapped in competitive relationships, even with family. In Columbia, children were shaped differently, but just as completely. They were taught that white Americans were chosen by God, that other races were inferior, that violence in service of righteousness was holy. They learned Columbia's mythology in schools, memorized Comstock's sermons, participated in ceremonies that celebrated manifest destiny and racial purity. A child raised in Columbia would grow up unable to question authority, unable to imagine that America could be wrong, unable to see the humanity of anyone Columbia categorized as other. They would become perpetrators or victims, oppressors or oppressed, with no middle ground, no space for complexity. Elizabeth was the exception that proved the rule, isolated from Columbia's indoctrination, raised on books that showed her different perspectives, developing empathy precisely because she was denied community. Her imprisonment paradoxically saved her from Columbia's worst lessons, allowing her to remain capable of change when she finally escaped. Eleanor was similar, bonded to Delta, influenced by his choices, developing morality through relationship rather than ideology. Her mother's attempt to erase her individuality failed because the bond to Delta preserved something Lamb couldn't control, an example of compassionate strength that undermined collectivist certainty. Both girls survived and grew into women capable of genuine choice because they had been partially protected from the systems that created them. But what of the children who weren't protected, who internalized the lessons fully, who became exactly what Rapture and Columbia intended? They became splicers, so addicted to power that they destroyed themselves pursuing it. They became founders, so certain of their righteousness that they committed atrocities without conscience. They became vox populi, so consumed by justified rage that they became the monsters they fought. The cycle perpetuated because damaged children became damaging adults, because trauma compounded across generations, because no one stopped to ask whether the systems themselves were the problem rather than individual failures within those systems. Breaking the cycle required something extraordinary. It required sacrifice of the kind Elizabeth made, drowning Booker before he could become either the failure who sold Anna or the prophet who stole her. It required the kind of choice Delta made, sharing his consciousness with Eleanor rather than clinging to his own existence. It required what Tenenbaum did, choosing to save Little Sisters despite it costing her power and influence. These were not grand ideological victories, but small personal ones, individual decisions to prioritize the next generation over present advantage, to break patterns rather than perpetuate them, to choose differently, even when it cost everything. The children who survived the little sisters, saved by Jack, Eleanor, escaping with Delta's memories. The timeline where Anna grew up with her father represented possibility, the chance that the next generation might avoid repeating the previous one's mistakes. But that chance was fragile, dependent on choices that people weren't guaranteed to make, on compassion that couldn't be forced or programmed. This was the final truth of both cities. They were built by people who claimed to care about humanity's future, but who sacrificed actual children to abstract ideals, who valued philosophy over the vulnerable, who prioritized being right over doing right. And they fell because children refused to cooperate with ideology, because human beings at their youngest were irreducibly complex, because innocence resisted corruption, even when corruption seemed inevitable. The little sisters sang about angels even as they harvested corpses. Eleanor loved Delta even though the bond was created through torture. Elizabeth dreamed of Paris even from her prison tower. Anna, in the timelines where she lived, presumably learned to be human despite having been sold and stolen and fought over. Children carried hope precisely because they had not yet hardened into certainty, had not yet committed fully to any ideology, still retained the capacity for change. Adults built Rapture and Columbia. Children inherited the ruins. And in those ruins, if you listen carefully past the sound of splicers and propaganda, you could hear children still singing, still dreaming, still somehow hoping that tomorrow might be different than yesterday, even though yesterday had taught them that tomorrow would bring only more darkness. But they sang anyway. In the deep and in the clouds, in the impossible cities built on absolute truth, children sang uncertain songs. And in that uncertainty, that refusal to accept that the world was fixed and finished, lived the only real hope that either city ever contained. The lighthouse stands, the cities fall, the children sing, and the cycle continues. Eternal and changing, constant and variable, always drowning and never quite dead. Because that's what human beings do. We build, we destroy, we hope despite evidence, we try again despite failure, we dream of paradise and create hell, and somehow, impossibly, find love in the ruins. Would you kindly remember them, all the dreamers and the doomed, the saved and the sacrificed, the monsters and the children who refuse to become monsters despite every reason to surrender? Remember that both cities asked the same question: what happens when philosophy becomes everything, and answered it with corpses and ruins and little girls singing in the darkness. Remember that there is always a man, always a city, always a choice that creates worlds or destroys them. And remember, finally, that in the space between absolute individualism and absolute collectivism, between unchecked freedom and enforced unity, between Rapture's depths and Columbia's heights, between Ryan's certainty and Comstock's certainty and Lamb's certainty and every other absolute truth humanity has ever claimed. In that space, uncertain and fluid and forever undefined, is where human beings actually live. The story ends, but the pattern continues. And somewhere, someone is building another lighthouse, another city, another absolute truth that will become another beautiful nightmare, because we never learn, can never learn, will build and burn and drown and rise and try again, forever seeking paradise and forever creating its opposite, eternal in our hope and our failure, drowning in metaphor and surfacing in myth, human to the end and beyond. And with that, the dream of Rapture is set into motion. If this story kept you listening, consider leaving a like and subscribing for more immersive game narratives. Until the next story, I'll see you there.